Thank you all for joining. Just another reminder that we are recording this session. So thank you all, everybody, for being here today on this snowy day. And we'll see how that new way to say good morning went, and we'll keep trying to perfect that with this large group. So our agenda for today, we have a busy day. We have two topics to talk about around the bigger area of new referrals to the DRC, dog bite referrals, and then neighbor disputes from the Police Department Community Engagement Unit. We're going to start with the dog bite referral discussion. I know that this was publicized that Ariane Slay was going to be here this morning. Unfortunately, she had a not good family emergency that she had to take care of. So John Reiser, who is the senior assistant Ann Arbor City Attorney, is going to, his words, pinch hit for her. I am fully confident he's going to give us a wonderful presentation. So thank you so much, John, for stepping in today. After John talks about the types and the circumstances where referrals are made, we'll turn it over to Laura Witkowski, who is a certified dog trainer from Good Wolff Dog Training. She has expertise in understanding fear and aggression in animals and will help us understand that and consider some option for dispute resolution between the parties. After that, we'll have a discussion with the Ann Arbor Police Community Engagement Unit around neighbor disputes that they will be referring to us as well. I'm going to turn it over to John in just a minute to kick this off, but I did, even though Ariane is not here today, I did want to go on the record with a disclaimer from the DRC. As you know, Ms. Slay is currently the Ann Arbor Deputy City Attorney, and you may or may not be aware that she has thrown her hat into the ring for Washtenaw County Circuit Court Judge. Before she had done that, we had already reached out to see if she could participate in this session. But I did want to be very clear with everyone that by policy and practice, the Dispute Resolution Center doesn't endorse any candidate for any position. And I wanted to make sure that no one misinterpreted that by having her here that was any kind of endorsement by the DRC. Anybody have any questions or concerns around that? Okie doke. I also, before John gets us started, I wanted to say that I will be monitoring the chat, and I'll be monitoring the raised hands. So feel free during the presentations, if you want to raise a question, just raise your hand or send me a chat and I'll read it out for the group as well. So with that, I think I will turn it over to John. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, folks. Yeah, Ari's unexpectedly away. So you've got the B team, you've got me pinch hitting for her. I'm not running for anything, I'm running from things mostly. So do I have screen sharing privileges?
Yes, you should.
All right, I'm going to do that, and I hope that you see a PowerPoint and not my cat videos. Let me click on this one. What came up, please, and thank you.
Yep, we see your presentation.
Okay, and I might toggle between that and the ordinance itself. So by way of introduction, what I got, 10 minutes, maybe 15 max? Try to bring it in.
Yep.
Okay. So I used to be an assistant prosecutor for a long time, since '99 and then the mid-'90s in another county. And these animal cases are tricky cases. They get a lot of media attention. They get a lot of attention from victims who are bitten. People who own these dogs have a lot of emotional investment in these, and they can be really tricky cases. So first at the outset, Mary and I want to thank you for your anticipated role in helping us with these things. So this show you see 3 rectangular pretty slides in blue, green, and green?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So we're going to talk about diversion and deflection programs. And last year, the city of Ann Arbor got a lot of money, frankly, from excise marijuana tax revenue that the city council dedicated entirely towards these diversion and deflection and alternative, non-police response and other ways of dealing with justice involvement. And one of those is the diversion and deflection of cases. So rather than a case being authorized for prosecution, it gets kind of set in abeyance. That's what the deflection is. Rather than someone who commits a crime of some sort, a misdemeanor crime, rather than being charged, they'll kind of address the root causes. And Aries been having these people do like essays on the impact of that kind of thing. And then the case gets kind of set aside and then never charged. So that would be an example of a deflection. A diversion might be where the case is charged and formally it goes into the court system, and then the same kind of thing happens. There's attention, treatment given to the person, and then the case ends up getting dismissed. So a deflection is a pre-charging setting aside, and whereas a diversion, it kind of gets adjourned for things to happen and it gets dismissed. And then we have funds for these programs. We also have an expungement program that with the 15th District Court Probation, people whose convictions arose out of Ann Arbor, which is a lot of them, because that can be juvenile, that can be circuit court felony, that can be misdemeanor. They can live in Ann Arbor, they can work in Ann Arbor, some connection to Ann Arbor. We can help them get those expungements set aside. And then why we're here today, bottom one, ding, 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 mediation with the DRC. And that's what you folks do. So the historical purposes of prosecution, taking it from punitive to rehabilitative and restorative. So as you can see, there's programming designed to address the root issue of the justice involvement. Why are they there? What behaviors need to be addressed, need to be changed, accountability for their actions, and atonement with the community / the victim. And for the victims, it's an opportunity for restorative justice and healing. And also, we have requirements with respect to the Crime Victims' Rights Act to let people know when court dates are, to give victim impact statements and restitution. Of course, there aren't court dates with mediation, and there aren't court dates with deflection. And with respect to the advantages to the community at large, it promotes transparency, trust, it repairs relationships, most importantly, especially in these animal cases, which are often neighbors, and it reduces the systematic injustices stemming from the justice system involvement. And with respect to the police officers, we have these treatment courts. It's a way for police officers to be involved in community policing, sharing of themselves with the community, and we'll hear probably more of that from Doug, Mark, and Trika. Moving on, this is Aries' presentation. So I'm presenting it for her. So the slides, if they look good, it's due to her, not me. But here's what we've got here, a dog bite. And we have a number of ordinances, as our state laws. Townships have these ordinances. In Ann Arbor, you're required to have a dog license and you're required to have rabies. And you get either a 1 or 3 year license depending on to match the rabies vaccinations. Now, our law requires that dogs be under reasonable control, not off a leash, not on your neighbor's property, not barking up and down the street. Dogs can't be a noise nuisance, which is barking till the wee small hours, or they can't be a sanitation nuisance, which, it's not leaving their trash around, it's leaving their feces around. So those are potential violations. And then animals can't be vicious. And then I'm going to share a different screen if I I'm going to try to share a different screen by clicking on this. Do you see, did a different thing come up?
Yes.
So
Yep.
this is kind of, this is our ordinance, and a dangerous animal is an animal that has bitten another person so as to cause visible trauma, such as a puncture wound, laceration, or other piercing of the skin, or cause broken bones. It's repeatedly attacked, chased, provoked, or menaced any other person or dog, or it's damaged the property, including animals of persons other than the owner. Okay, so this is what I think, Gail, when we were talking ahead of time, it's likely this portion that's going to bring this matter to the attention of law enforcement. Something happens with an animal and the police are called, the police respond, and the police take a report, and then the report comes to the city attorney's office, and then the question for me and Ari is, okay, now what do we do with it? Do we do a deflection? Do we charge it? Do we do a diversion? If it's a pretty serious case or something, it could get sent down the road to Ellie Savage's shop at the county prosecutor's office. But if it's like when a dog bites another dog, or when a dog bites a human, oftentimes police are called for animal control. Herb Schroeder's the animal control officer. I love the guy. He's a great guy, but he's one guy who does animal control throughout the entire county, working, 40 hours a week. So to be honest, in the city of Ann Arbor, the most likely first responder is going to be the Ann Arbor Police, although it could be animal control. And then, dogs can't bite other dogs and humans. We also have dog parks. A flare-up or a situation could arise at a dog park, and the dog parks that we have these various rules. We've got noise ordinances after 10, before 7, and I guess 10 isn't the wee small hours, but after a certain hour, dogs are supposed to be quiet. Sanitation nuisances, and that we spoke about, and then under reasonable control, and that is being on a leash, and then vicious animal is it's most likely going to be a step above mediation, but it really could be, and that's bites or attacks a person or causes a serious physical bodily injury, resulting in hospital confinement, reconstructive surgery, or the impairment of a bodily function. So that's a more serious. So vicious animal is a 90-day misdemeanor. Well, all these others are just civil infractions. So getting back out of here, that's our ordinance. And I sent a link to these ordinances to you, Gail. I sent this PowerPoint if folks want it later, and I sent some links to these ordinances. So this is what Ari's got here is a summation of these. Animals can also be impounded after they've bitten someone in kind of home confinement to make sure that they don't have rabies. And they can also be confined at the Humane Society. So here's what happens. 911 gets called, or something happens with an animal that impacts another member of the community. So 911 gets called, or they go to the front desk to report it. A police report is generated. The animal control or the Humane Society or AAPD, somebody looks into it. Humane Society is generally more centered around animal cruelty. Sometimes these cases involve animal cruelty, but so there'll be some response, and then it gets sent to our office. So the warrant request from the police to the city attorney's office and victims' rights compliance, and that could be for restitution, for medical bills, for vet bills. And now we've got 5A and 5B, right? So y'all come in at 5A. Make sense? DRC referral, that's you folks. So instead of doing a warrant request or charging something and issuing a civil infraction by way of a ticket or a potential warrant and complaint for a misdemeanor, it goes to 5A, and that's where you folks come in. And then if 5B does happen, it can be deflected or deferred. But so you're here at 5A, DRC referral. The case closed at the city attorney's office, no charge. But that doesn't mean you don't charge us for your services. I don't mean by that. I mean, there's not a criminal charge or a civil infraction. Any questions so far? Because I'm not looking at the chat.
I haven't seen any, John, so I think you're good.
Okay. I don't want to ignore anybody. This is Sean Harris. Let me know if you need a bigger picture of her. I can work on that. But this is Sean that Ari embedded into this PowerPoint. She is our victim advocate certified, and she notifies the victims via telephone, email, however we get a hold of her. And sometimes if it's a dog bite, a dog can bite another dog, so there'll be a vet bill. I had a case in Ann Arbor where a dog got loose, a very aggressive dog, crossed the street, bit the dog. The human tried to intervene, bit the human. So you know, all that kind of thing. And then Sean kind of guides them through the criminal process. That won't happen once a case is handed off to you folks at the DRC. So mediation or prosecution. The mediation is referring it to the DRC. We send notice to the involved parties. I mean, rather, I think you folks do that, send notice to the involved parties, and then the bill shall be paid with the diversion funding that I referenced earlier. And now, if it's a prosecution, my apologies on these clocks, folks. Submit the formal charges for the prosecution. I'm going to kind of gloss over this because you guys, that's not your function. We're trying to go to you guys. We're trying to keep it out of the justice system to make it more community oriented, if that makes sense. And then, so here's what the kind of stuff you might get. You're going to get a police report from the Ann Arbor Police Department, maybe a supplemental report from Animal Control, Herb Schroeder at the county, maybe somebody from park staff. So that could happen at a park. So you're going to get a police report. You might get some photographs. You could get some body worn camera. You could get some patrol video. You could get medical bills for human or for animals. Those are the kind of things that you'll be able to have. These are the contact information for me and for Ari. And there's questions for Ari. With respect to the remedies, some things you might be able to do that help resolve these cases at your level. It's like, okay, is the dog licensed? Does the dog have its rabies shots? Can we get the dog licensed? What about a rabies shot? What about a fence, a physical fence, an electrical fence? What about restitution, making the victims whole financially for their out-of-pocket for the medical, for the vets? What about some sort of obedience class or dog training? More on that from Laura Witkowski, thankfully, instead of me. That's her gig. And something that sometimes happens, and this is beyond my skill set, is neutering or spaying of the dogs appropriate. I don't know if that's something that the Humane Society recommends or doesn't recommend, or Laura recommends or doesn't recommend, or what impact that may have had on it. But that's like kind of a root cause addressing and then dealing with. So that's kind of it in the time that I have. Unless
John,
there are questions. Yes, ma'am.
I do have a question for you. Could you talk a little bit more about the role that Sean plays, who does victim rights?
Sean is wrangling all this stuff from our, wrangling isn't the right word, but it kind of is, getting information about what are your medical bills, what are your vet bills, kind of things like that. So she's kind of our interface with the victims on these things until it gets turned over to you. I wouldn't anticipate that once it's turned over to you that she would be doing that. And I mean, I think that would be between you folks, but getting that initial information from the victims, the initial contact with them if that's needed.
Thank you, John. Muffy, if that doesn't answer your question, just chime in again. And I believe, Joan, you have a question. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I do. I would love to know what the city is looking to the DRC to accomplish. Could you try to phrase as completely as possible what your idea would be of a successful outcome by the DRC with the cases that you send to us?
Okay, so an incident happened out there in the community that impacted people negatively. So how do we address that person's concern? How do we get the dog owner to realize that he or she has the obligation that it doesn't happen again, and to, I don't know, atone might be too strong a word, but to acknowledge the harm that call. You know, you've got a dog and you might be callous. Oh, my dog doesn't bite. My dog's very friendly. People are so emotional about their dogs, not that they shouldn't be, and don't realize that sometimes their dogs really scare the heck out of other people or do things to other people that they might not. So to get them to appreciate what has happened and to try to take steps that it doesn't happen again, if possible. I mean, does that make sense, Joan?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Any
you,
other
John.
I guess the other question might be more for the DRC, but is that more mediation or more of circle keeping?
Yeah, that's not my, yeah, that's,
That would be for Gail.
yeah, that's Brenda's. But
Or Belinda, I'll let you handle that one.
Linda.
I was planning to just listen today, but I think it is a good question, Joan. And I think sometimes cases that come to us could be a little bit of both. It is up to the staff to figure out where does it fit most neatly. So when we talk about harm, taking responsibility for harm, being accountable, impact of the harm, that sounds more of a restorative justice circle. So that's where I'm landing right now. But I also want to say to the group that let's wait and see with our first case and see what the parties, how they respond to things before we jump to any conclusions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. And we have probably time for one more question. And I think, and one question was, could this also include property damages? John?
Potentially, not wanting to sound callous, but pets and dogs are property of the person who owns them. So a dog could include property as, and I don't mean that to sound as mean as it does. So the animal itself could be property. But if there's property damage, if a fence is torn through or property is dug under to get under a fence to get at the backyard chickens or whatever, that could potentially be part of making that victim whole. If that answers your question, Alexandria.
Thank you, John. And one last one, just another clarification on the role of Sean Harris. Is she involved in all the cases, and does she help decide where the cases go?
No, she doesn't. She's not a gatekeeper, so to speak.
Okay.
She's more of a, like I said, a wrangler, kind of she coordinates getting that information from the victim and turning it over and getting it to the right parties. So not a gatekeeper, if that answers it.
Yep. All righty. Well, John, can you unshare your screen?
Doing
Thank
that
you.
right now.
Thank you. And folks, as we carry on today, if you think of questions for John, put those in the chat, and if we have time at the end, maybe we can follow up, and if not, I can follow up after this session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Laura. So thank you, Laura, and take it away.
All right. Hello. Thank you for inviting me and letting me come talk to you first and foremost. And my name is Laura Witkowski. I'm a certified professional dog trainer. I work with dogs in various capacities, but one of my focuses is fear and aggression. So I get a lot of cases in which dogs have bitten people or other dogs. So one of the things I thought would be really helpful would be to kind of talk about the way that I look at a bite in terms of prognostic indicators, and how I kind of like basically separate the emotion so that we are looking at, the information in front of us and not being as clouded by the emotion, because, as was already stated, people are very emotional about their dogs, and that completely makes sense. People are also very emotional about teeth on skin. I mean, it's just our evolutionary brains just have a really, like we really get freaked out by teeth on skin. So it causes a lot of emotional impact for sure. I think it's really great that you guys are going to be taking these cases. I'm going to share my screen. I don't think my thing's going to be nearly as fancy, but I just thought this would be helpful so I can kind of show you. Here we go. Share. Can you guys see that? Is this being shown? Okay. Yeah. So I think you may have gotten this handout. I'm not totally sure. But when I have a case in which somebody's dog has bitten somebody, the things that I look for in terms of, is this dog safe? And is this a case, where we can move forward and not be concerned about like a public safety hazard? So context is huge, so the circumstances leading up to the bite, triggers that may have caused the bite to happen, and protracted warnings. So protracted warnings are essentially all the things that lead up to a bite. And I'm sure all of you have heard people say, like, the dog bit out of the blue, but that is rarely the case. Oftentimes there are lower level body language signals that dogs are giving off that say, I'm getting upset, I need space, I feel scared. And we as human beings tend to not see a lot of those. So oftentimes we don't notice until the dog is doing something overt, like growling or, putting their hackles up or, launching. So one of the things I look for is, does a dog give a lot of protracted warning? So think of protracted warning as a fuse. So for instance, some dogs have really long fuses. So for instance, think of like a golden retriever who's extremely tolerant of like a 6-year-old, and just the 6-year-old might be doing things that are a little bit obnoxious, but the dog has got a really long fuse, so he's really able to handle it. Whereas another dog might have a really short fuse and might have a really hard time even being near a 6-year-old. So if I'm nervous and scared and I have a short fuse, that is more concerning to me than a dog who gives a lot of warning that they're starting to get upset. I have a few illustrations that I'm going to show you as well to kind of give you an idea of protracted warnings and triggers, and also talking a little bit more about the body language that I do look for and that I talk to my clients about looking for with their dogs. So one of the graphics I have is called the ladder of aggression, which I'll show you at the end of this. And just to take some of the emotion out of it, to me, the term aggression, the way I define it, is essentially anything that a dog is doing to overtly get distance from something or someone they're considering a threat. There are certainly some other situations, like for instance, dog-on-dog cases can sometimes be less aggressive and more predatory, which we don't have to get into that, but it's really, I think, important to think of this as the dog's intent is to get distance from a threat. I find a lot of times, in cases like this, people will spend a lot of time trying to figure out the dog's intent. And the dog's intent is to get distance, so there's no reason to be like, was he, does he not like this person? Is he feeling spiteful? Like, none of that stuff is really helpful or even true. How often are the bites occurring? So frequency, and over how long a period of time. So let's say a dog's been in a home for 5 years and has bitten 2 people in the last 4 years. Okay, well, that's concerning because obviously I don't want a dog to bite people, but it's less concerning to me than a dog who's been in a home for 5 months and has bitten 5 people. So how often is this happening? And how long a period of time? The other thing I look at, number 3 on this list, is ABI, which is acquired bite inhibition. So essentially, dogs, when they bite, so when they decide I need to use my teeth to ward off a threat or to get distance, it tends to be a fairly static occasion over time. So what I mean by that is once a dog is an adult, so 6 months plus, when they decide they need to use their teeth, we tend to find that those stay fairly static. So what that would mean is if a dog has bitten somebody, then we can use that to extrapolate what would happen if that dog bites someone again. So a dog with what we call good ABI would be a dog who bites somebody, but leaves very little in the way of damage. So, picture like a 70-pound dog who bites someone on the arm and there's like a little scratch and a red mark. That's a dog with really good bite inhibition. And to me, from a public safety standpoint, I think that's very, very important. One of the things mentioned earlier was about like some of the, medical issues and stuff that you might have And so that's something I look for. If a dog bites somebody and the damage is severe, they've done deep punctures, deep bruising, tearing, multiple bites, that kind of stuff, that is extremely concerning to me from a public safety standpoint. And it, to me, means we have to be even more careful about how we proceed. And then the fourth thing, and honestly, to me, one of the most important, is owner compliance. So what is the owner's commitment and follow through regarding mitigating future bites? Obviously, sometimes these bites happen because people are not being particularly compliant with dog laws and they're letting their dogs run at large, or, they have a hole in their fence that they haven't fixed and their dog knows how to get out, whatever the case may be. But if a client calls me and basically says, I will do anything that I need to in order to make this work, that gives me a good sign that there's somebody who's going to be fairly compliant. And another thing I look for in terms of a barometer for compliance is something like muzzle training. So for instance, if a dog does bite someone and it's a bad bite, I want that dog to be trained to be tolerant of and comfortable in the muzzle. If an owner proceeds with and finishes doing muzzle training, that's another huge sign to me that we've got owner compliance. I'm probably going to be able to have this person stay on board with me and do the things necessary to mitigate future bites. Another thing that I think is important to talk about a little bit, and there's so much information here, so sorry about barraging you with all of the stuff, but dog training is not a regulated field in any way. So you do not have to have any particular license, certification, or qualifications to be a dog trainer. So that means that people are not always doing the same things in terms of their techniques. And some of the things that are used pretty prominently in dog training in terms of like punishment of aggressive behavior, we actually find that can make aggressive behavior worse. So for instance, if somebody's dog bites somebody and then they start employing like punishment, like, so, okay, you bit a kid, so now every time, you even look at a kid funny, you're going to get in trouble. You're either going to get, if it's an electronic collar, maybe you'll get zapped, or maybe you get a leash pop, or maybe I yell at you, maybe I shake pennies in your face, whatever the case may be. We're punishing the behavior of looking at that kid wrong. So, but we have to recognize those to the dog. They just see that as an association of, kids really get you in trouble because you're not even allowed to let people know that you're feeling uncomfortable. So now what a dog learns through this situation is do not give off any overt warnings. Do not tell anybody that you're upset. Basically keep it all inside until you can't anymore. So what I call that is behavior suppression. So in other words, like, you're not allowed to growl, you're not allowed to back away, you're not allowed to do any of the things that say you're upset or else you'll get in trouble. Dogs do what works. So if a dog gets in trouble when it growls, it goes, okay, I'll just not do that. I'll go right to biting. So oftentimes behavior suppression is at play when you do see a situation in which it seems like a dog has bitten out of the blue. That usually is a dog who has learned that their early warning signals either get them in trouble or don't work. So you might as well just jump all the way up to the top and bite somebody. So that's just something that's important to keep in mind. And another thing too, we talked about like the dog license, is it up to date on rabies? Is there proper containment? And the other thing mentioned was like an obedience class. And I think a really important clarification here is typically an obedience class is not what an aggressive dog needs. It's really, in some respects, less training and more stringent management. So oftentimes with my bite cases, the first thing I do before I even do any training is come up with a very stringent management protocol so that we can mitigate any future bites. If a dog bites a kid that crawls under the table when he's hiding under there, okay, well, I can easily keep that dog out of that situation. I can also train that dog to do some distance increasing cues that could be really helpful when it's upset. But the thing I can do right now is come up with a management strategy so that we know what we're going to do with that dog when there's kids present. Whether that's baby getting them into another room, putting them into a crate, letting them outside, whatever the case may be, we're going to make sure that we have that in place. So the last things I want to show you are these graphics that I think are really helpful. And also too, like the body language of fear, canine letter of aggression. I don't use fear and aggression interchangeably per se, but I think it's really important to point out that almost all aggressive behavior comes from a place of fear or concern, or, I feel like there's a viable threat. So it's really important to notice that the fear issue is a super strong component. So body language of fear, learn to recognize dog's body language. So I'm going to show you some of these. This is a little, little drawing of a greyhound. But these are all lower level signals a dog might get that give that they're upset. And quite frankly, before I started working with dogs, I didn't notice any of these. Like for instance, you'll see this one that says like licking of the lips, like my mouth is closed, I'm sticking my tongue out, yawning. Another thing I see is a dog's like trying to keep an eye on you, but trying to also stay away from you. These are really low level signs that the dog is uncomfortable. And it's really important to notice those, because if I notice a dog's getting uncomfortable, I can intervene then, or I can teach the owner how to intervene then. We don't have to wait for the dog to be showing super overt signs that they're upset. If a dog is showing that they're uncomfortable, intervening there can mitigate future bites. So there's a lot of stuff on here that I think is fairly helpful. Some of the things are, you've probably seen dogs do and never really thought about it. You might even say like, oh, wow, I've seen my dog do some of these things. But these are really helpful, I think, in terms of understanding a little bit more. And something I go over a lot with my clients is reading their dog's body language. Canine ladder of aggression. I kind of like this because it's literally a ladder. And it literally does go up these rungs, which I think is very helpful, because starting at the very bottom, these are really low-level signals that a dog is starting to get upset and feeling threatened. And oftentimes, we don't notice any of these things until we get maybe up to stiffens and stares or growls. So oftentimes, the very top of the ladder is the only thing dogs find fairly effective in order to get someone or something to move away. But if I move towards a dog and they move away from me, they walked away. I don't need to like keep coming up to them until they start growling at me. They're showing me that they're uncomfortable. So these are all really important things to look for, and something that when I'm looking at the safety of the dog, I want to know like what is, how do you climb that ladder? Do you go up every single rung? That's my favorite, because that says that you have a longer fuse. Or do you go on the first step and then jump all the way to the top, which is another thing a lot of dogs do, which I think for prognosis makes it harder because you have less time to intervene. Trigger stacking is a huge thing with dog bites. Almost all dog bites involve trigger stacking, which is essentially like something happened that stressed me out at the same time as something else. Earlier in the day, something else happened, and then this happened. So oftentimes we find that not only are triggers present, but they have to be stacked in order for that to happen. So for instance, a dog might not bite a kid who's walking by them, but they might bite a kid who's riding a skateboard by them when a fire truck goes by. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what all of the triggers are, but figuring those out to the best of our ability allows us to keep the dog out of that situation and do a good job with a management strategy so that we don't have dogs in situations where they could potentially bite someone again. I think that, again, the training component I think is very important, and I absolutely train my fear and aggression dogs to do many things that are very helpful, mostly distance increasing things, or recall. So if I'm noticing my dog's upset, I want that dog to have a really good recall so they, leave the thing that they're concerned about and go see their human. So I know this is a lot of stuff. So if anyone has any questions or wants me to go over anything more in detail, because there's a lot here and I know that. So I hope that that's been helpful.
Anybody have any questions for Laura? And we will be sharing this handout. So the intent here isn't that we all need to become expert dog trainers, but it's just trying to give you some background on how these situations occur, and that because it occurs does not necessarily mean that, the dog is a bad dog. It's just the situation that occurred. Laura, someone did ask a question around, in a really bad situation, is there, is it appropriate in your mind for euthanasia for an animal?
I mean, I hate to say yes, because that sounds really flippant, but if a dog has, shown me that their prognostic indicators show that they're not a particularly safe dog, and we don't have high owner compliance, then that is a public safety issue. And so it's not safe to have that dog in the community if that dog is potentially going to do serious harm to somebody or to another dog. So as much as that's not the outcome, of course, that most people would want, I do think that that's something that could potentially be an issue here. It looks like John was trying to weigh in.
Yep.
Yeah,
Go ahead, John.
Before you guys start ordering that around,
Right.
there's a specific statute that talks about when you can and can't euthanize an animal, and that's kind of something that's got to be court ordered. And I would think that ordering the euthanization of an animal is beyond the scope of mediation, facilitation, peace circles, but that's not my bailiwick. But just know that that's something you just can't do absent a court order. Courts are loath to do that as well, frankly. It might be an appropriate remedy, but that's more of a legal, I would think, than facilitative or mediative.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to jump in if I can. I raised my hand on that topic, and I appreciate John jumping in right away. It is my hope that when these cases occur with the city's legal department, that they're doing the amount of vetting to determine if it's appropriate to come to the DRC in the first place.
Yeah.
That is the part of the conversation that Ariana and I had, I think back in December or so when we connected on this. So keep that in mind. I want the volunteers to know that the reason that we partner with the institution is so that they can apply their expertise first and determine if it's appropriate to come from the DRC. So it would be my guess that nothing that will rise to the level of such seriousness where that kind of determination needs to be made with the court would ever get to us. That is my hope.
Thank you, Belinda. Kathy Gorley, you had a follow-up question, I believe. You're on mute, Kathy.
Yeah, I was the one that asked that question, but I was foreseeing the situation where the two parties agreed that that would be the right solution. I know I have a neighbor where their dog killed our chicken, and he said right away, if you want us to put the dog down, we will. We value our neighborliness better. We didn't want that, but I could imagine a situation where the parties did agree that would be the best situation. So it wouldn't require a court order, I don't think.
Okay.
And again, I would hope that the attorney's department is doing, when I say vetting, I mean that they've made some contact with the parties, they've looked at all of this material before they say this case looks suitable for the DRC. I guess at the end of the day, and now with the understanding that that a court's intervention is needed in order to make that decision around euthanizing an animal, we have to hold that boundary and say, well, that requires this legal action, so we have to send that back to the prosecutor's office or to the DA's office. Would that make sense, John?
Yeah, we're not trying to oh, this is an ugly case. We don't have the guts to do it. Let's throw it on the DRC.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I got your back on this, Belinda. No, we have statutory remedies that we can do this when it's appropriate. And if you've got the dog that keeps attacking and and it's the dangerous dog and there's been serious things, and this is kind of the first time of, this is for smaller scale stuff, but more common stuff than those anomalies, if that makes sense.
Thank you, John. Michael, I believe you had a question?
Yes, thank you. This is for Laura. Have you been in any situations where you've worked with both the the owner of the dog and the person who's been bitten? And if so, could you sort of talk about how that went?
I have not. I think in many respects it could potentially be a conflict of interest a little bit. I certainly, for instance, I have a case right now where a dog bit a neighbor dog, and it was a pretty substantial bite. And so I have been checking in to see how that dog is doing, but I'm not working with those people, partly because I'm working with their neighbor and I wouldn't want them to think that I was trying to play sides or anything like that. But oftentimes I find that working with just one party is probably more ethically sound for me, just so I don't get into any tricky business. I wouldn't be completely opposed to it though, if that was something that two parties wanted to do.
Well, I'm thinking even just being in communication with the neighbor who's aware of what's going, sort of being part of. Obviously they're trying to work on a solution, but being part of that solution, which would mean, perhaps, just telling the neighbor what you're doing or how it's planning, et cetera, somehow being in communication with that neighbor and keeping them in the loop. Is that what you're doing in this particular situation at all?
Typically what I do is I will write up a consult report that tells everything that I saw in our consult and talks about whether I think this dog is safe and, what we should do going forward. And I often will tell people, you should give this to your neighbor. Let them have a copy of this so that, number one, they know that you are being proactive and are doing something. You've contacted a trainer, you're putting together a management strategy. I think that can show your neighbors a lot of, goodwill in terms of like, we're taking this seriously. We're not just, oh, well, you got bit, so I find that can be really helpful. And it also can be helpful because it can help the person who got bit or whose dog got bit understand a little bit more about how it could have happened, because there is a lot of taking things very personally. When someone asked about euthanasia earlier, one of the things that I get concerned about is someone who feels more out of a sense of vengeance. They want the neighbor's dog euthanized, as opposed to that's actually what would be the best outcome in this case. But that's also something that you might have to deal with if there's those kinds of really heavy feelings where one party wants, a different outcome than the other. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Yeah, and then a question for the group. So, because clearly if we're doing a mediation, there is going to be some sort of connection already going on. And I'm wondering, since we're not really supposed to propose solutions, how does the person whose dog has bitten someone find out that Laura or any other groups are available as an option to work on the aggressiveness of the dog?
Well, that would be, and another thing that Laura and I talked about when we were when we were planning for this session is just managing the emotions. So I think a lot of it is going to rely on your skills as mediators in terms of managing emotions and sort of back to our earlier discussion around good questioning, floating suggestions without, have you considered, what are some of the things that you've considered and some of the ways that we get people to think outside of the box without telling them what to do.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a few more minutes, so I know Jennifer and Audrey had questions, so we'll go through those and then we will move on to the Ann Arbor Police Department. If anybody else has any questions, shoot me a note and we'll follow up afterwards on those. So Jennifer, you want to give us your question quickly?
Sure. So my first thought is, I think as mediators, we need to be prepared if someone brings up the idea of asking to have a dog euthanized. I've had that in mediation. It was not the appropriate solution. But if you want to watch emotions rise, put that on the table. So I think we just need to be prepared to have our strategies, whether it's a caucus or whatever it needs to be. And then my question relates to Mike's. I think it would be great if we could refer somebody, for example, to Laura. There are a lot of trainers. It's not well regulated. And so somebody can sign up with a trainer that actually isn't the right skill set for what they need. So I don't know if we'd be allowed to do that. So I'm just asking if the DRC or maybe the courts already refer them. So yeah, just seconding that idea. Thanks.
And Audrey, do you want to go for your question? Thank you.
Yes, John mentioned funding being offered. I missed that, and I was hoping he would repeat the funding that is available and what the funding covers or what the funding comes from. Where does that come from?
Well, the city of Ann Arbor, and I don't know the mechanics, and I don't know if Ari and Belinda have talked about how much it's going to be, whether it's up front, whether it's at the end, whether there's a cap on it, whether it's an hourly rate. That's kind of, I just don't have those details. Maybe you know, Belinda, but I don't. And I can text Ari or follow up with that on the details.
Well,
Okay.
but that is something that Ariana and I did speak about, the cost of our services, and was there a budget to cover the cost of the services. She did talk about there was some fund, but I don't know the name of it. I didn't know until right now. I didn't know where that money came from. I also encouraged her to speak with the police department because of our next presenters will talk about work that we're doing with them. What she agreed to do is to do some follow-up work on that so that the DRC can get some payment for the services that we deliver, and we can avoid having, in one municipality, you have 2 or 3 different silos of things going on, maybe work together, and maybe the city of Ann Arbor will, in whatever way they do, and I don't care where the money comes from, whatever they do to pay the center for the services that we're now delivering to a third and maybe a second and a third entity of the city of Ann Arbor. We work with their district court. Now we're going to work with their DA's office, and we've started to work with their police department. So that's the kind of background conversation we intend to keep having.
All righty. Well, we need to move along from dog bites to neighbor disputes. So if you have any other questions about the cases that we just discussed, please shoot me an email and I'll get a response and share it with the group. So with this, I would now like to turn the presentation over to Officer Zebak and introduce her as well as her colleagues, Officer Martel and Sergeant Pulford.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that. I probably will defer to Sergeant Pulford just because he's got the share screen ability. But basically, this whole idea came about for us because Doug and I in our unit often get handed issues between neighbors that are not criminal in nature but repetitive for the police department, and officers respond to the same venue or the same groups of folks frequently with really no resolution. We were looking for a different way. A lot of times officers will come to us and say, is there something that you can do? And like, I don't have a magic wand any more than you do, so let's come up with something. So just got to talking about the
Whoops, I think you froze up there, Officer.
I can jump in here.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So I'm Sergeant Pope for the Ann Arbor City Police, and I recently took over our community engagement unit in the past 2 months. So, I'm having a lot of fun in this unit. I'm excited to partner up with you guys. I know the officers are looking forward to having additional resources. So they work the road, and there are times
having some technical difficulties with their computer doesn't play nice sometimes. So
yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes, as Officer Zebek said, they're repetitively running out on some of these calls, and they go unresolved because not really criminal issues. So I'll share my screen here just so you guys can see the referral form that we came up with.
Okay, so while Trika's trying, Mark's going to share a screen. You gotta jump in there, Mark.
Yep.
Yep.
You guys can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
All right. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little better here. I mean, it's pretty simple form. So this is our call for service or case report number. That's just for our reference and records in case anything comes about or anybody has any questions on it. It tells us exactly where to look. And that'll tell us when it happened, what it happened, who responded out to it. The referring officer, their badge number, reporting resident, basic information, their name, email address, phone number, and the best time to call. We added a checkbox for the best way to contact them for you guys to see. And then the responding resident. Reason for contact, whether it's a housing, landlord, neighborhood, family, business, consumer, workplace dispute, and then a brief synopsis of the concern. I did inform the officers to keep it neutral, basic, that way you guys come into it with a neutral point of view. And then this may or may not be initial before it comes to you. Our officers are required to have a supervisor review this before, basically before the night's completed, just to ensure it's a non-criminal event. So the last thing we want is something criminal gets sent over to you guys, and you get involved, and then all of a sudden the victim's calling up and saying they want to prosecute, and then we have, a mix of things going on. So command officer will review it, ensure it's non-criminal, and then it goes over to Jillian. For now, we can change this at any time, obviously, and then over to our records section. So that's the form that you guys may be seeing. Although this is a pilot program, so, if something's not working, just let us know, and we can always amend things as well. Do you guys have any direct questions for us? I mean, we're new to this. I think we've had just a couple forms submitted so far, and we're just going to kind of monitor and see how it goes.
Could you talk a little bit, Sergeant Pulford, about the types of cases and the scenarios when that you would be referring to us?
Yeah, I mean, we'll find out. It's anything non-criminal. So some of the things just that have run through my mind is occasionally we'll get people, they'll say, my neighbor's porch light shines into my house, and they always turn on at night and I can't sleep. Or maybe they're disputing over a parking spot, in a private lot where we really have no jurisdictional enforcement that we can do. I've recently had somebody call up and they're complaining about their neighbor's incense that they were burning, and she, can't live there, and she can't, continue breathing that in, and he honks his horn at various hours of the day and the night. Now, some of that we may have, be able to help with as far as noise stuff, but it's not always that easy, as you guys know. Anything you guys can think of, Doug or Trika?
Well, just from past experience. Hi, everybody. I'm Doug Martel. I've had ones where folks they have driveways that they share. They kind of butt up to one another the way their houses are configured on the street, and one person would blow their snow on the other person's driveway after they'd already blown their snow, or now it's so deep it's hard for me to shovel because they've thrown all their snow onto my driveway. Another one was this particular lady had a neighbor who was had lots of he would trap like mice and small rodents, and their garages were right next to one another, and so there's probably about a 4-foot gap between the garage walls, and he would throw the carcasses of the dead animals between the garages. And she didn't really like that very much, and I can't say as I blame her. So just a couple of real kind of off the top of my head examples of what comes across our bow from time to time.
Somebody asked to see the form again too, so I'm going to load that up here. It's specifically the dispute portion of it. So housing/landlord disputes, neighborhood, family disputes, business and consumer disputes, and workplace disputes. In regards to family disputes, that area, it certainly won't be anything domestic violence related. We have regulations. All of that has to be reported over the prosecutor's office, but family, maybe they're disputing with a distant relative or something like that.
Sergeant Pulford, will you all be informing the parties that this has been referred to mediation, or what's the process?
So officers are required to get consent from both parties, so they both have to be willing to participate in this program before a referral is even made.
Oh, you get your drink, so.
Okay. All right, thank you. Any other questions from anyone about the types? I think Officer Zebek, you mentioned that we did get a referral, or we had a case that came through?
Yeah, it sounds like there was a referral about a driveway situation where there was accidental property damage for Officer Boylan had submitted it. I don't know who it went to. Obviously, it started with Jillian, but accidental property damage on a joint or alleged accidental property damage on a joint driveway from a delivery driver. Initially, both parties told Officer Boylan that they were willing to participate. The referral form process was completed on our end and it was sent to Jillian. And then it sounds like, if I understand it correctly, once we got there and DRC reached out, the actual reporting party decided they didn't want to go any further. Am I correct there? So that's the first one, I think, officially that has been used through our process. I know prior to getting this up and running, a couple of officers, because we have a sheet of different resources, a couple of officers had taken it upon themselves to, tell people to reach out to the DRC. Once we started working with Belinda and figured out that we wanted a particular process to run a certain way, we dissuaded them from doing that until we got this up and running. So, although we've had a successful one yet, but it's baby steps.
Jennifer, you have a question?
Yeah, I just have a clarifying question. So when we have court-ordered mediation, they have to come to mediation, and then they can decide they don't want to do mediation, and the case goes to court. But in this case, just so I understand, their participation is entirely voluntary, right? So even if they signed up or agreed on the form, if they don't show up for mediation, I mean, it's there. Am I getting that right, Belinda?
So I'll jump in if it's okay. So in the state of Michigan, only a sitting judge or jurist can order people to mediation. So the police department cannot do that, and that's by court rule. So the Ann Arbor Police will give the neighbors information. We've given them our what we call counter cards, so they have information about the DRC. The police department will complete the form that we just saw and send it over to our office. Jillian is the point person on that, so she'll get that form. And then we'll do what we do for most cases. We call people, I think because we're doing this virtually, all cases get a phone call or some contact by a staff person of the DRC to see if the participants really want to move forward with our services. Assuming that both parties agree to move forward, we set up the session like we always do, and we announce it to volunteers so we get you assigned to the case, as we do with most of our cases. The reason why we're calling this a pilot is because it's not brand new. I think many years ago the center did this with the Ann Arbor Police, so we're sort of reinvigorating it. And as many of you know, I look at the data. A big part of my job is to report data to the State Court Administrative Office, to the DRC board. But because of that, we wanted to pilot this and really monitor it to see if people are responding to this service that the police department is offering them. So we can see the data. So we got a case, it didn't go anywhere. We've closed it with whatever that outcome is. At some point in time, the police department has agreed with me that we'll sit down maybe March, April or so when I compile the data, that we'll look at it and say, hey, is this really worth the time? What's happening? Are they getting repeated calls from these neighbors? What's going on? And then we can adjust and maybe proceed from there. This is what we do. We've done this for every program that we've implemented with an institution. And so we're going to follow that protocol again, just to see if it's working for all parties involved. Our neighbors, I think once a few cases get to the mediation, then they'll talk about it. What we have learned is that people will talk about their good experience in mediation, and they might be willing to try it again or tell the other neighbors about it. But we're at the very early stage of this. We don't want to overwhelm the volunteers. This is just another kind of case that we're going to experience, but in the background, we're monitoring it through the data and letting the police department determine if this is really worthwhile. I think it's worth noting that when I got the initial call from, and I'm sorry, I forget names and ranks, I think it's Lieutenant Fox, that he's a lieutenant. When I got the first call from Lieutenant Fox, basically what is being said, what he said was that we get these calls for neighbor disputes and several officers show up because they have to respond to the call. Then they find out that there's nothing that they can do. So that's frustrating. It's frustrating for the officers. There's no crime. There's nothing for them to do, but they've spent time there. So the police department reached out to us thinking that maybe there's something that we can do. And so I applaud them for thinking outside the box and trying to do something to still assist the neighbors, the residents of Ann Arbor, short of the things that law enforcement actually does. Because they could also walk away and do nothing and just kind of let that situation keep brewing. So we'll give it a try and see what happens, and hopefully we'll get some good results. But as we know at the DRC, things take time because this is a shift in expectation and culture. People call the police because they want the police to do something, right? So we're talking about a culture shift, different kind of messaging in the larger community. So be patient, because I recognize that this might take some time.
I have a question for the officers. How have you gotten any feedback or sense of when you have discussed mediation with the parties, kind of what, if they understand what it's about, how much explaining you have to do about that to kind of encourage them? How's that process gone, that encouraging them to consider mediation to resolve this issue?
I would say Doug and I don't think have direct knowledge of it because we're not the ones that are on the road engaging, and because this hasn't been used too frequently at this point, I don't know that I can give you that. I can certainly pull, I'm sorry, Belinda, if you had.
Yeah, another thing that's going to come, I think coming soon, the DRC has been invited to some of your, you have your training.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're going to be on your agenda to talk to the officers about who we are, what we do, maybe, and I think that kind of conversation will unfold. Gail, what can they say to hopefully encourage people to cooperate with us when we call after that referral?
I just wanted to add on real quick, kind of adding on to what Belinda said. It's frustrating for officers as well to keep going repetitively to places and feel like while it's frustrating for us, it's equally, I think it leaves a bad taste in the public's mind when we respond and they feel like we didn't do anything for them, which is part of the reason why we wanted to outreach and find an area where people felt like if we couldn't be their outlet, at least we could help them find an outlet. Because we don't want to leave anybody with the impression that you called us and we're the police and we're supposed to be able to do everything, and we can't. So we know what our limitations are, and this, unfortunately, this is one of those areas where we don't have the resources to spend the time that we might need to. So we reached out, which hopefully will end up being beneficial. I also know that Ann Arbor, I work very closely with groups like Community Action Network and Ann Arbor Housing, and I know that they've enlisted the services in some of their housing complexes of the DRC. I've worked with some of the coordinators there and know that there are some people that are receiving services because we've responded. We have neighbor complaints that we can't deal with, so they try to take the different avenue. So it's really, I think we kind of parallel each other a lot. It's just where the referral comes from. If it comes from a housing coordinator or if it comes from the police department, we're just kind of trying to go to the professionals that might be better suited to deal with or have the time to deal with that kind of situation. So.
Thank you very much. Let's see, I think we have time for a couple more questions. It looks like we'll go to Joan and then Craig.
Just wondering if dog barking is enough of a nuisance, and does it get reported, and how do you handle that? Excessive dog barking by a neighbor's dog.
Dog barking is obviously we just talked about it. It's a noise complaint. The difficulty that the police department that we come across is that a lot of times if we get there, it's not actively going on. We don't take enforcement action. So the only other alternative is to hope that the person that's calling it in is willing to be a complainant. We would have to file a police report, and then we ship it to the city attorney's office to see if they would authorize us to be able to write a ticket for it when we're on scene, not witnessing something. And it kind of sounds like that, given the city attorney's office now has this, dog bite, dog kind of diversion program, I foresee at some point they're all going to kind of intertwine, because if we keep responding to a dog complaint, barking dog, and there isn't anything that we can witness, or we submit a report to, John or Ari about this particular house, maybe together we refer it to DRC.
And is it something that dogs should be expected to be able to learn not to do?
I think that I can't speak to that, I would say.
Sounds like
That's a personal opinion.
That's for Laura, I think.
Help, Laura.
Yeah, that's a Laura question.
Okay, Craig, your question? Thank you, Joan.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm curious. I've heard some stuff about like the idea of an unarmed response, whether it's directly part of the police department or something adjunct to the police or somehow community partnership kind of thing. And I'm wondering, it sounds like some of the things you've been describing here are that might fall under that category, whether it's for the reason of just avoiding, you know, an armed policeman showing up for something that doesn't really warrant that level of response, or for people in the community who are just afraid of the police in general and getting the police involved. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I could speak a little bit to that. It was brought up in our community meeting last night at one of our ward meetings. So we don't have direct knowledge. We're not necessarily involved in a lot of those conversations. Some of the concerns expressed from the citizens in the meeting are like, at some point we have so many different numbers and so many different specialties, like who the heck do I call when I need help? So, you know, the chief had mentioned the goal would be when you call that the appropriate resource responds to fulfill your need. Now, how that's done, I guess, is what's being determined now. I think it's going to be probably a somewhat lengthy process to implement something and then actually evaluate it and see what's working and what's not. I don't know if that helps much, but of course we want the appropriate resource to respond. And
so I am aware of the unarmed police response. It is a word, a phrase that they're using. I just can't think of it right now. And I've been on the periphery of some of those conversations, Craig. And I think based on what I know right now, I think everyone is speaking separately, but talking very similarly about the same thing. So we'll see where it goes. But what I can say about that, I think it's still in its, I would say it's still in its early stages of discussion. I don't know if any decisions have been made. Was the decision made at this recent meeting you went to, Officer?
no, this is just a citizen community meeting. There was a few
Okay.
questions raised. Yeah,
I think they're still in their early stages of it, but the DRC is, you know, we're not on any committee, but we're on a periphery of that conversation, so we can see where it goes. I think, and ironically, and I think what is helpful is that all of these different people are contacting us to see how we can fit. And I'm saying that the different people who are contacting us need to also talk to each other so that we can have one thing, and not, because the DRC does not have the capacity to have 15 different silos happening. We have to work, we promote collaboration, so we're promoting that in that space too.
I think it's important. We didn't contact the DRC or Belinda, I guess, representing some kind of unarmed response, because regardless, you guys aren't going out there as civilians, and we are still going out there as armed response. We contacted them because we feel that we can't meet the needs of some of our citizens. And so it wasn't, there wasn't any, you know, this wasn't part of an unarmed response discussion. This was just a way to meet the needs of the officers and the citizens.
Yes, thank you for that, Trika.
I'm sorry. The acronym for that group is CROS.
Thank you, Audrey. And Greta, I saw your hand go up and down. We have time for one quick one. If you have a quick question before we wrap up.
Not so much a question, but an assertion that this is needed. I was involved in a case, it was not in Ann Arbor. It was allegedly a small claims case where somebody supposedly yanked the cord out of a remote camera and pulled the guts out, but it turned out over the course of 3 hours that there had been issues building slowly over time. And so although it was a small claims court case, we also included rules of behavior, starting with neither party will post anything about the other party on social media. And so I'm not sure, what the magistrate will do with that or how you follow it up, but it was very clear that they needed instruction on how to behave with each other since they lived, 4 feet apart. Their houses were so close together, and we couldn't just let it go. So it's nice to know that there's going to be some alternative ways of legitimately handle neighborhood concerns.
All righty. Well, thank you, Greta. All right, it is time to wrap up. And in doing that, I want to give a huge thank you to all the presenters today. Thank you so much. John, thank you for stepping in at the last minute. We greatly appreciate that. And Laura, thank you so much for your wonderful information. And to Sergeant Pulford and Officers Martel and Zebek, thank you so much for your participation here today. I also want to thank everybody who showed up today. I hope everyone stays warm and safe and well during our winter storm. I sent the evaluation form for this session in the chat. And I would very much appreciate everyone taking just 1 or 2 minutes to complete that. Last time we only had 13 people that responded to it, so we want to up our game with that. So if you could take a minute with that. As follow-up to this session, I'll resend the evaluation form. I'll send John's presentation, the city ordinances regarding dog bites. I'll send Laura's handout as well. And maybe I can send a copy of that intake form from the police department too. Our next session is on March 2nd, same time, same place, 11:30. Our presenter is going to be Brian Pappas, who is one of the DRC's board members and is also a professor at EMU. The topic of his presentation is going to be mindful mediation, and about how his mediation practice is a meditation practice as well. I'm going to be including an article for you to read prior to that session, and I'll send that out with all the information that's follow up here. So again, thank you to everyone. Stay healthy and safe, and see you soon.